Okay, so in this video I want to look at utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is a secular, consequentialist and teleological ethical system. This means that you do not need to believe in God, or there are no relationships to assuming that there is a God to use this ethical theory. It's a consequentialist, meaning it does not look at the intrinsic action, it looks to the consequences to work out whether it's right or wrong. It's teleological, looks to an end, a purpose. The three main advocates of this type of ethical theory are Bentham, Mill and Singer. All three of them have different forms of utilitarianism: act, rule, and preference. However, they all follow one basic principle, the principle of utility, which is we must produce the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people. So let's start with the very first type, act utilitarianism by Jeremy Bentham. Now, he observed that people were motivated by pleasure and they always seek to minimize pain. So what he said is that if an action increases an individual's or community's pleasure, then it is the moral thing to do. Now, he said, how do you work out whether it increases pleasure? He used more of a scientific calculation, and he used something called the philosophic calculus. Now, what this means that there are 7 criteria, and and you put a numerical substitution to each criteria. 3, for example, giving 3 for the highest amount of pleasure produced in that criteria, or 1 for the lowest amount of pleasure produced in that criteria. If you are comparing two actions, the actions with the largest numerical total, then that would be the moral action to do, because it would be increasing the most pleasure. So let's look at the 7 criteria. So firstly, the 7 criteria goes like this. Number 1, intensity. How intense is the pleasure? 2, duration. How long does it last? 3, certainty. How certain is it that an action is going to happen? 4, remoteness. How far into the future is it of getting that pleasure? Are you going to receive the pleasure today or the pleasure next year? 5, fecundity. What are the chances of the pleasure being followed by other pleasures? So, for example, if I give money to charity, then there is high fecundity, because I know that will probably save someone's lives. For example, that will cause a family's happiness, the whole society's, a workplace, her children, and blah 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 blah, etc. 6, the extent of the pleasure. How many people, how wide, how many people does it affect? And 7, purity. So what are the chances of this pleasure being being followed by pain? So if I commit murder, that might be a pleasure for me, but I'm likely to be followed by pain because, court laws and the victim's pain, etc., etc. So that was Bentham's version of utilitarianism in a nutshell. Now, we call this version universal ethical hedonism, and basically for him the most importance lies in the calculation, whereas John Stuart Mill came along and he said no. Firstly, he wants to so John Stuart Mill comes along and he says that motivated by pleasure, are you sure about that? What about selfless organizations such as Catholic Christian Aid? And it's really impractical for every moral action. Are you going to sit there with a pen and paper using the 7 criteria to work out which action to do? It's impractical. And for Bentham, happiness was a supreme moral good. Mill said no, it's justice, because Mill believed in what we call higher pleasures. I'm just about to come on to that. So what Mill said is that there is not just pleasure or pain. There's pain and there's 2 types of pleasures, and he distinguishes between this. This is the higher pleasure and the lower pleasure. The higher pleasure includes things to do with the mind and spiritual, so activities such as praying, reading, learning. Low pleasures are more to do with the body, animal needs. So these can include eating, exercising, having sex, these kind of things. And for him, the higher pleasures hold more value, so they're weighted more than the lower pleasures. And he says that if you choose a lower pleasure over a higher pleasure, you are said to have an infirmity of the mind. Now, there's a famous quote he uses to kind of summary this, which is that it's better to be a dissatisfied Socrates than a satisfied fool. So how did Mill develop this rule utilitarianism? He said what we can do is we can use general principles. So if we can take from higher pleasures and lower pleasures, on average, it is likely that lying would cause more pain than pleasure. We can have a generalized rule. do not lie. However, these rules are general rules. Unlike Kant's absolutist theories, they can be broken because this is a consequentialist theory. So what he's trying to say is that first you look at whether it's a higher pleasure or lower pleasure. If you are choosing what is more moral, you should definitely go for the higher. From there, you've got to see, is it breaking any rules? If not, then you could look at the calculation, the hedonic calculus, etc., etc. But the main difference is he looks to the rules and he looks to the type of pleasure. So then Peter Singer came along and he put down something called preference utilitarianism. And he said, forget the higher lower pleasures. People work to satisfy their preferences, and this is what causes pleasure. So if my preference is that I want to be a millionaire, and so for that I should start my business now, that would be the moral thing to do, because I'm satisfying my preference, and that is what happens in reality. We don't look at what's spiritual and what's physical. We don't do that, he says. And he says that what distinguishes preference utilitarianism isn't just the fact that it's based around preferences, not rules or any specific calculation, is that, according to Singer, animals are no less human than us. They feel pleasure and pain, and they are looking to satisfy their preferences. In their case, it would be eat, survive, reproduce, whereas for humans it can be a range of things. So that would be preference utilitarianism. Now, the problem with utilitarianism is that how can we accurately predict consequences? We cannot. It is not easy to predict consequences. If I want to go and insult someone, 90% of the chance, 99% it will upset them. I can predict it correctly. But what if that 1% chance happens? They're a person who enjoys pain being inflicted to them. I've got the consequences all wrong. And also, it's an absurdly demanding theory. For example, I want to have ice cream. I go out to pay to get an ice cream. That would be considered unmoral, because that money I could have spent giving to charity to produce the future pleasures, whether it be any other type of utility. Preference is slightly different because my preference is ice cream, not helping others. But it's still basing around that your preference should seek to satisfy the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people. It can also be known, utilitarianism, for being too impartial. For example, if a house is burning down and there's a brilliant surgeon in there and your mother in there, and you have to go in and you can only save one person, are you really going to serve the brilliant surgeon because they produce the greatest amount of happiness, or are you going to go to your mother? It's really, just like Kant, no room for emotions and compassion and family ties, and reality of it, there's no room for it. And also, what if through utilitarianism what's moral for one person is not moral for another? It's not like Kant, where you have actually absolutist rules, do not do this, do not, do not, do not, do not. It's actually very different, because what he's saying is that if, for example, for me, it's more moral for me to give money to charity. For someone else, it might be more moral to get an ice cream, because that might be their preference, or they're not breaking any rules, so the happiness on the hedonic calculus works out better for them. So this is how we can work out. Sorry, this is quite a snappy video because YouTube's not allowing me to post longer videos, and I hope this helps. Please visit my blog.